Hello, good ones. We promise. There will be no boring minutes here. So, shall we turn to the next page? Rain pounded the windshield of the rental car, each drop breaking into 1,000 tiny splashes, merging into the murky ripples of the Chicago evening. The hum of the engine mingled with the squeak of the windshield wipers, which were trying unsuccessfully to keep up with the downpour. I leaned forward, the steering wheel almost touching my chest, squinting through the mist and the blurry lights of the streets as I made my way through Lincoln Park, an old neighborhood where gray brick houses clung to each other as if trying to hide from the damp and wind. I had long since grown accustomed to these streets. In my 36 years, I had driven along them so many times that I could close my eyes and still turn toward our house with its black, wrought iron porch and peeling number plate that we had never changed. Sarah liked to call our house the warm cage, a cozy old townhouse with high ceilings and creaky floors. She put both tenderness and a touch of irony into these words as she did into everything. I didn't call her, didn't text her. Surprise, I said to myself, holding the steering wheel with one hand and clutching the paper cup of her favorite caramel latte from the tiny cafe on the corner of Clark and Diversey to my leg with the other. It was still warm, though the rain had soaked through my coat to the lining. Sarah loved sweet coffee as much as she loved walking barefoot in the morning on the cold kitchen floor. She was 33, and sometimes she seemed younger to me than anyone else in the city, with her wild shock of red hair that she always kept pinned back with a pencil, and her eyes the color of the March sky, slightly faded but always alive. She talked quickly and laughed a lot, often throwing her head back so that the fine veins on her neck showed. We had met 7 years ago in this same neighborhood when I was still a freelance journalist, lugging a tape recorder and a notebook around editorial offices, and she was a budding photographer, shooting shop windows and random passers-by. We rarely argued, but with each passing year, strange pauses settled into our conversations heavy like this rain. Sometimes I was away on business and found myself calling less often than I should. Sometimes I returned and found her eyes tired and absent, although her lips still greeted me with a smile. The canceled flight, the storm, the flooded O'Hare Airport, it all seemed part of a strange conspiracy that had decided to bring me back here a day early. I imagined her opening the door, in an old sweater that always smelled of mint and watercolors, with a soft, elusive smile. Maybe she wouldn't even have time to hide her brushes and the cup of tea that was always left on the windowsill. Surprise, I said out loud to myself, and there was more hope in the word than I was willing to admit. I pulled into the driveway, tires crunching on wet gravel. Our house, 2 stories of red brick, covered in ivy as if it were trying to take over, looked silent, almost too still under the weight of the storm. The windows were dark, except for the dim light from the kitchen lamp we always left on. I grabbed my suitcase from the trunk, latte in the other hand, and ran to the porch, my boots squelching with every step. The air smelled of rain and asphalt, sharp and alive. Inside, I shook out my coat, leaving it in a wet heap by the door. The house was warm, the familiar scent of Sarah's lavender candles in the air. I set my coffee on the hall table and listened. The soft hum of the water in the pipes told me she was in the shower. Perfect. I could slip upstairs, unpack, and wait with a latte when she emerged, all soft and surprised, her hair still damp and curled at the ends. I smiled at the thought, the smile that seemed to belong to a younger me, the one who'd slipped flowers into her duffel bag, only to see her roll her eyes and laugh. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed, my suitcase tapping softly against my leg. Our bedroom was at the end of the hall, the door slightly ajar, a shaft of light spilling onto the wooden floor. I pushed it open and stepped inside, the familiar space enveloping me like a worn jacket. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled in the casual way Sarah always left them. Her yoga mat was rolled up in the corner, next to her weights and a half-empty bottle of water. I set my suitcase down by the dresser, trying to make no noise, and turned to head downstairs. And then I saw it. A glimmer of color beneath the bed, barely visible in the dim light. I froze, my pulse quickening. It was something small, seemingly insignificant, a sock, balled up and half hidden by the bed frame. I told myself it was nothing. Probably mine, forgotten under the bed in one of my morning rushes. But something about it felt wrong, like a note played out of tune. I crouched, my knees cracking in protest, and reached for it. The fabric was rough to the touch, a cheap blend, not the soft cotton socks Sarah insisted on buying me. Black, with a thin red stripe at the top. I turned it over in my hand, the weight of it feeling heavier than it should have. My stomach clenched as, almost against my will, I brought it closer and inhaled. The smell hit me like a slap pungent chemical, like cheap drugstore deodorant mixed with something earthier, dank. Sweat, not mine. I sat back on my heels, the sock dangling from my toes like evidence from a crime scene. My mind raced, trying to piece together an explanation that wouldn't hurt. Maybe it belonged to a friend who'd stayed over after a party. Maybe Sarah had accidentally picked it up from the gym where she trained clients. But those thoughts felt as fragile as paper dissolving in the rain. I knew her habits, her routine. She was meticulous about her space, her belongings. There was no way someone else's sock would just end up under our bed. The shower stopped, the sudden silence louder than the sound of the water. I dropped the sock back where I found it, my hands moving faster than my brain could process. I didn't want her to know I'd seen it, not yet. Not until I figured out what it meant. I stood up, legs shaking, and grabbed my suitcase, backing into the hallway as if running from something. The latte was forgotten on the table downstairs, probably cold by now. I leaned against the wall, my heart pounding in my chest. The house felt different now, like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to decide what to do next. Sarah's voice came from the bathroom, humming a pop song I didn't recognize. It sounded happy, carefree. The sound twisted something inside me, a mixture of love and fear that made my throat tighten. I thought about the last few months. Work had been relentless, endless meetings, late nights, trips to New York and Seattle that left me exhausted and distant. Sarah had been patient, for the most part. She'd smile when I'd apologized for missing dinner, kiss my cheek when I'd promised to make it up to her. But there had been moments small, easy to dismiss when her gaze lingered on her phone just a little too long or her laugh had seemed forced, like she was playing a part. I'd chalked it up to stress, to the grind. Now they seemed like clues I'd been too tired to notice. The bathroom door creaked open, letting a stream of warm steam into the hallway. Sarah stepped out carefully, her bare feet on the cool floor. She was wearing only a large white towel, casually wrapped around her body, the end always trying to come undone, revealing the curve of her hip and a thin strip of light skin on her side. Drops of water slowly trickled down her neck, ran down her collarbones, and disappeared somewhere under the edge of the terry cloth. She ran her hand through her wet hair, thick, heavy, a copper shade that seemed almost fiery under the yellow light of the hallway. The strands stuck to her shoulders and shoulder blades, leaving wet marks on her skin. In the semi-darkness of the apartment, her face seemed especially open without makeup, with slightly pink cheeks from the hot shower. A tiny drop glistened on the bridge of her nose, which she was in no hurry to wipe away. Sarah had always been beautiful, beautiful in that simple, almost casual way that required no adornment or mask. Narrow wrists, a gentle curve to her neck, a light gait that seemed to barely touch the floor. Even now, with her hair wet and a towel instead of a dress, she looked as if she could have stepped off the cover of an old movie, bright, real, unpretentious. "Mike," she called, frowning slightly. Her voice was quiet, a little hoarse from the hot steam. "Are you home?" She clutched the towel to her chest and looked out into the corridor, and at that moment her eyes met mine. Blue, slightly darkened in the semi-darkness, they glowed with surprise and some kind of childish hope. In that second, she seemed infinitely close to me and suddenly frighteningly distant, as if there were still hundreds of miles of rain and canceled flights between us. I forced a smile as I walked back into the bedroom. "Yes, honey. The flight was canceled. Thought I'd surprise you." Her eyes widened, and for a split second, I thought I saw something flicker across her face, panic, maybe, or guilt. But then she smiled, crossed the room, and hugged me, her skin warm and damp under my shirt. "You're all wet," she said, laughing, pulling away. "Why didn't you call?" I wanted to see that look on your face, I said, trying to keep my voice light. Her scent vanilla and something floral filled my lungs, familiar and disorienting at the same time. I searched her eyes for something, anything, but they were clear, calm. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe the sock was nothing. "Are you okay?" she asked, tilting her head. "You look, I don't know, tired." "Long day," I said, waving my hand. "I bought you a latte, but it's probably cold by now." She laughed again, quieter this time, and went to the dresser to get her leggings. "You're cute. Let me get dressed, and we'll warm this up. Hungry?" I nodded, watching her movements, the easy grace of her body as she pulled on her clothes. She was beautiful, she always was. The kind of beauty that didn't demand attention but held it anyway, with her sharp cheekbones and the way her dark hair caught the light. I wanted to ask about the sock, to blurt it out and see how she explained it, but the words stuck in my throat, heavy and shapeless. Instead, I said, "I'm going to take a shower. Meet me downstairs." "Perfect," she replied, flashing a smile that seemed to belong to another life. I waited until she left the room before looking at the bed again. The sock was still there, hidden in the shadows, a small, ugly secret. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The kitchen smelled of freshly brewed coffee, but the aroma, usually soothing, now seemed foreign, almost acrid, as if it belonged to another house, another life. I sat at the table, clutching the empty mug, my fingers still shaking slightly from what I'd found upstairs. The sock black with a thin red stripe, saturated with the smell of cheap deodorant, and someone else's sweat was lying somewhere under the bed, like a mine ready to explode. I tried to convince myself it was a mistake. Maybe it had gotten into our laundry, lost among the linens from one of Sarah's training sessions with her clients. Maybe one of her friends had left it behind when they stayed the night. But those explanations were cracking at the seams like an old shirt, unable to withstand the pressure of the truth that was already beginning to seep into my thoughts. Sarah tilted her head slightly, studying me. Something prickly flashed in her gaze, but she quickly hid it behind a soft smile. She came closer, her feet barely making a sound on the tiles. "Would you like some wine?" she suggested cautiously, as if she were offering not a drink, but a truce. "There's still some white. I didn't finish it yesterday." She opened the cabinet, took out a tall glass, and placed it on the table in front of me, but I didn't touch it. "I don't want to. I don't want to yet," I said, watching as drops from her still damp hair fell onto the collar of her t-shirt, leaving dark spots on the thin fabric. "Mike, you're not just tired," she said softly, but her voice was a little quieter. She put the bottle back without pouring anything. "I see. I know you. What happened?" I shrugged slightly and tried to smile. "Nothing, really. It was just that everything came together: the airport, the rain, the damn transfer. And you know me, I've always hated these sudden surprises." Sarah snorted and smiled faintly, though her eyes remained wary. "Surprises? You like to make surprises yourself," she said, leaning over the sink and turning on the tap. The sound of water filled the kitchen for a second. She rinsed her hands and dried them on a towel. "Remember how you came to my birthday party with that stupid camera-shaped cake? I spent 2 days washing the cream off the lens." I nodded but didn't answer. The words were stuck in my throat. She straightened up and looked at me again, her head slightly tilted, like a cat trying to see something in the dark. "Mike," she said quietly, and this Mike had everything: reproach, concern, and something disturbing that she herself, it seemed, did not want to let out. "If something is wrong, if you want to talk, just say so. Okay? Don't need this." She waved her hand, as if brushing away an invisible barrier between us. "Your silence." I swallowed. The kitchen was warm and smelled of something cozy, her shampoo, and something spicy, from the lasagna, I guess. But inside, everything felt cold and stone. "What are we talking about?" I said quietly. "It's okay, Sarah. It's okay." "You say that," she sighed, pressing her palm to her chest as if something there hurt. "But you look at me as if I don't know, as if you don't know me." I slowly raised my eyes and met her gaze. For a second, just a second, I thought I saw something foreign flicker in her face, something that shouldn't have been there. As Sarah fiddled with the coffee maker, humming something unintelligible, I mentally reviewed the last few months. Her phone, which she put away too quickly when I walked into the room. Just a client, she'd say, smiling that smile that used to make my heart skip a beat, but now only caused a twinge of suspicion. Her late arrivals from training, she'd explain it away as new students, extra classes, but I'd never asked for details. I trusted her. I always had. But now these moments formed a chain, and each new link made it heavier. "I'll be right back," I said, getting up from the table. My voice was calmer than I'd expected, almost casual. Sarah turned, raising an eyebrow slightly, but said nothing, just nodded and went back to her coffee. I left the kitchen, heading for the bathroom, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe I just needed to move, to keep my thoughts from overwhelming me. I told myself I'd just wash my face, wash the fatigue and this damn day off my face. But really, I was looking for something else, confirmation or disproof of what was beginning to form in my head. The bathroom was warm, with a faint scent of steam and Sarah's shampoo. The mirror was still slightly fogged up, and her towel hung on a hook, damp and soft. Her creams and lotions were neatly arranged on the shelf. As always, Sarah was meticulous about such things. I turned on the tap and splashed cold water on my face, hoping that it would clear the fog from my head. My gaze slid to the trash can by the sink, small, white, with a pedal. Something pushed me to press it, although I couldn't even explain why. Intuition, fear, desperation. The lid opened with a soft click, and among the crumpled tissues and empty shampoo bottle, I saw its shiny silver foil, crumpled but immediately recognizable. An empty condom wrapper. My heart hit my ribs like someone had punched me in the chest. My hand shook as I reached for the foil, my fingers barely cooperating as I pulled it out and unfolded it. A cheap brand like the kind you'd get at a corner convenience store. But that wasn't the point. The point was that Sarah and I hadn't used condoms in 2 years. We'd stopped after we'd decided we were ready to have kids. She was on the pill, and this was a shared decision, a step toward the future I'd pictured in my head, us, our home, a child laughing in the backyard. Or was it just my future? I stood there, clutching the damn package until my knuckles turned white. A storm raged in my head, anger, disbelief, pain, all mixed into a caustic mixture that took my breath away. I wanted to storm into the kitchen, throw the foil on the counter, and demand to know who, when, why. But I didn't move. Instead, I carefully placed the package back in the trash, closed the lid, and turned off the water. My hands were still shaking, but I forced myself to breathe evenly, deeply, as if it would keep me from falling apart. I couldn't let her see that I knew. Not now. Not until I knew how far this had gone. When I returned to the kitchen, I found Sarah sitting at the table. She had one leg tucked under her and was gently bobbing her heel to the beat of something playing in her earphones, one in her ear, the other on the table next to her phone. She was lazily scrolling through her feed, her thumbs swiping across the screen, and in her other hand she was holding a mug of coffee. A thin steam was rising from the mug, and for a second I wanted to cling to that smell, bitter, fresh, ordinary. I wanted to go back to that moment when everything was still simple. Coffee, Sarah, me, the kitchen. Without these unnecessary thoughts, without these guesses. Her face was calm, almost serene. She looked as if everything around her, the rain, the storm, my nerves cracking inside, had nothing to do with her. "Everything okay?" she asked, without even looking up. Her voice was light, slightly mocking, as if she was not reading my silence seriously, as if it was ordinary fatigue, ordinary melancholy after the journey. "Yes," I said and sat down opposite. The chair creaked softly as I pushed it back. My voice was even, too even as my fingers clasped together in my lap under the table. But inside, everything was screaming. Something was breaking inside me without a sound, like a crack slowly creeping across glass. I looked at her, the woman I had loved for over 10 years. At her dark hair, slightly damp at the temples. At the thin fingers with which she hugged the mug, as if drawing warmth from it. at the barely noticeable crease between her eyebrows, a sign that she did feel something, understood something. Or was it just my imagination? A sock under the bed. A package in the trash. Her, "I'll work in the studio a little longer." Her late arrivals, the calls she took in the other room. Her laughter, which used to warm me, but now hurt me with something alien, almost mocking. Her phone, which she turned face down when she put it on the table. Her smiles, those smiles that were for everyone, but now, it seems, not for me. These were all pieces of a puzzle. I was afraid to put it all together because I knew that when I did, nothing would be the same anymore. But I couldn't stop. The puzzle was putting itself together quietly, mercilessly, every piece of thought clicking in my head, falling into place. I looked at her, and for the first time I didn't know who she was, or who I was in her life now. Sarah finally looked up from her phone. "Are you sure you're okay?" she asked a little softer, and reached out her hand to my arm, but I moved away just slightly. She froze, and something flickered in her gaze, not fear yet, but a question. I forced myself to exhale. "It's okay," I said again. "I'm just tired." And inside, I was already preparing to ask her everything. But not yet. Not yet at this moment. The next morning came too quickly, as if the night had decided to shorten itself to bring me face to face with reality. I woke to the soft light filtering through the curtains and the sound of Sarah's breathing next to me. She was curled up, her dark hair spread out on the pillow, her face calm, almost angelic. I looked at her, and for a moment I wanted to believe that all of this, the sock, the condom wrapper, my suspicions had been just a bad dream. But the cold in my chest, the same one that had settled there yesterday, reminded me that this was no dream. This was my life, and it was falling apart at the seams. I could have made a scene. I could have woken her up right then and there, thrown that damn sock and the trash can packaging on the bed, demanded answers, screamed until I was hoarse. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the fear that the truth would be worse than I could bear. Maybe it was the hope that I was wrong, that it could still be fixed. Or maybe it was pride, the reluctance to show how deeply I was hurt. Instead, I chose a different path. I put on a mask. The mask of the perfect husband who hadn't noticed, who still loved his wife as if the world wasn't crumbling beneath his feet. I rose quietly, careful not to wake Sarah, and went down to the kitchen. The coffee maker was waiting, its metallic sheen catching the morning light. I brewed the coffee, her favorite, with a hint of caramel, and set the cup on a tray with some toast and a small bowl of daisies I'd picked from the garden. Daisies were her weakness, so simple, but she always smiled when I brought them home. I walked back up to the bedroom, tray in hand, and set it on the nightstand. Sarah stirred, her eyes opening slowly, and she looked at me with mild surprise. "Good morning," I said, trying to put all the warmth I could into those two words. I smiled, the same smile I'd always given her before, as if nothing had changed. My voice was soft, almost gentle, even though inside I was seething and pulling at the muscles beneath my skin, as if I was wearing a mask that was too tight. "I decided to pamper you." Sarah, wrapped in a soft blanket, lifted her head from the pillow, and her face lit up with that same smile, open, warm, the one that used to make my heart skip a beat and fall somewhere into my ribs. For a second, I caught myself almost believing in this picture, how we, the two of us, are still us. "Mike, are you serious?" She sat up in bed, pulled the blanket over her chest, and reached out for the cup. Her fingers wrapped around the porcelain so carefully, as if it were something fragile and precious. She brought the cup to her lips, inhaled the aroma of coffee, and looked at me as if our whole life was hidden behind that look. "You're so sweet. I forgot how nice it is when you're home." I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, trying to keep my smile from wavering. "I came home early, so I thought I'd catch up," I said, and sat on the edge of the bed, feeling the mattress give under my weight. I watched her take her first sip, slowly, with her eyes closed, as if savoring not just the taste of the coffee, but the moment. I tried to convince myself that everything was okay, that she was mine, that we were just tired, confused, and could fix it. But every second of that scene felt like a rehearsal, like I was looking at her through glass. I could see everything, but I couldn't really touch her. Maybe I was acting. Maybe all this tenderness was just for me, so as not to uproot the truth and not be left empty-handed. Or was it she who was acting? Or were we both actors in this strange play where no one else remembered the lines? That day, I decided to go further. After breakfast, I wasted no time. When she went to take a shower, I picked up the phone and called her favorite restaurant, that little Italian place with brick walls and lamps that looked like old lanterns. We celebrated our first anniversary there, and I remember her laughing, wiping a drop of red wine from her cheek, and saying that she would sit there with me 1,000 more times. I booked a table for the evening, the one by the window where she liked to watch the snow slowly fall or the spring rain drizzle outside. I wanted everything to look perfect. Maybe I wanted to catch her doing something, or catch myself red-handed and prove to myself that I was simply going crazy. Then I stopped by a flower shop. I stood at the window, looking at the bouquets, and felt how stupid and painful this gesture was. I took the rose's soft pink, not too pretentious, without unnecessary glitter and ribbons. The kind she always liked, nothing superfluous, Mike, she told me when I first gave her a giant bouquet with gold bows, and she laughed, calling it wedding morning. When I got home, she was sitting on the couch in an old sweater, leafing through a magazine, her legs tucked under her. She heard me open the door and immediately looked up. I walked over, handed her the roses, and for a second it felt like I was back in a time when everything was simple. Her eyes lit up. Whether it was real light or a well-acted one, I no longer knew. She screamed softly, hugged me around the neck so tightly that I almost didn't feel my breath. "Mike, what's wrong with you today?" she laughed, burying her nose in my neck. I could smell her sweet, warm, painfully familiar. "Are you trying to make me fall in love with you again?" I hugged her with one arm, and with the other I still held the stems of the roses, feeling the thorns through the paper. "Maybe," I said quietly, and my mouth suddenly felt bitter from how much I wanted to believe it was true. I kissed her back, my lips brushing her forehead, but inside everything screamed, lie. Every word, every gesture seemed like part of a disguise now, subtle but skillful. I smiled, holding her, but my thoughts were elsewhere in the shadows under the bed, in the trash can, in those details I could no longer ignore. The evening at the restaurant was almost perfect, at least on the surface. Sarah appeared at the bedroom door while I was still adjusting the cuff of my shirt, and for a moment I had to remind myself not to stand there with my mouth open like a boy. She was wearing that same black dress, her little black, as she called it, simple and attractive in its simplicity. The dress hugged her figure softly, emphasizing her slender waist and the smooth line of her hips. It revealed her collarbones and slightly open throat, leaving just enough for the eye to catch and not be able to leave. Her hair, tousled and damp from her shower that morning, was now done up long and shiny, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She had pinned a few strands casually to one side, revealing her ear with a tiny pearl earring. I remembered giving her those earrings for Christmas, and how she had laughed then, standing by the tree in her pajamas. She wore that same scarlet shade of lipstick that she wore only on special occasions. It made her lips look even brighter, more alive, as if everything else in the restaurant, the candles, the white tablecloths, the soft hum of other people's voices existed only to set her off. Her skin glowed in the soft light of the lamps, and every gesture she made, the way she crossed her legs, the way she traced the rim of her wine glass with her finger, the way she smiled at the waiter was measured and yet completely natural. Sarah knew how to be beautiful without effort. She simply breathed, and the whole room adjusted to her. We were sitting at our table by the window, the same one where I had promised her that first year that I would always be there. She was laughing, leaning back slightly, the dark silk of her dress stretching over her thigh so tightly that I could barely tear my eyes away. I found myself still admiring her, despite everything that was screaming inside me. We talked about small things. About her new clients, she mentioned a new couple at the gym, said her husband had hired her to do family anniversary photos, and laughed. We reminisced about my trip, and I said something about flight delays and a storm, and she listened, her chin in her hand. We talked about the neighbor's dog, who had dug up the flower bed again. She smiled, bit her lip, and for a moment looked just like the Sarah I'd shared the past decade with. But every time her gaze slid past me out the window, out the street, to the phone she'd tucked into her purse, but not too far away, I looked for something in her face. A hint, a crack, anything that would give her away. Her secret, our rift. Nothing. She was flawless. So beautiful that I would almost believe again if inside I didn't already know everything that my hands, my eyes, my heart knew. At home, I continued to play my part. The next day, I cooked dinner steaks, rosemary potatoes, her favorite goat cheese salad. I put on some music, the same jazz record we used to listen to when we first started dating. Sarah was thrilled, dancing around the kitchen, singing along, even tugging at my hand to join in. I laughed, twirled her around, but every time her hands touched mine, I thought of that sock, of the package, of who might be in our house, in our bedroom. That night, after Sarah had fallen asleep, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The darkness in the room was thick, but my thoughts were even darker. I couldn't keep pretending everything was okay while doubt gnawed at me inside. I needed proof, not just bits and pieces, but something concrete that would either dispel my suspicions or confirm them once and for all. I pulled out my phone, turned on incognito mode, and started searching. Within minutes, I found what I was looking for: a compact hidden camera with Wi-Fi, cloud recording, and a night mode. It was small, discreet, and perfect for hiding in my bedroom. I placed an order for next-day delivery, choosing a pickup location in a nearby neighborhood so Sarah wouldn't suspect anything. The next evening, after Sarah had gone off to her late-night workout, I set up the camera. I chose the corner of the bedroom where her bookshelf and decorative candles stood. The camera was tiny, no bigger than a button, and it hid easily between an old copy of Pride and Prejudice and a glass owl we'd bought at a fair last year. I connected it to the app on my phone, checked the image quality, and it worked. The bedroom, our bedroom, was now staring back at me through a cold lens, and I felt like a traitor. Not to her, but to myself. But I couldn't stop. Sarah came home later than usual. I heard the front door open, the soft creak of its hinges, the zip of her duffel bag. I sat motionless in the kitchen, an empty cup in front of me, listening to her every step, every breath. When she entered the room, it took me a second to force myself to stand up. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes were too bright. She was full of energy, freshness, the smell of the street and foreign space. Tiny beads of sweat glistened on her temples, which she quickly wiped away with her palm. "It's been a rough day," she said, kicking off her sneakers at the door and throwing her gym bag so hard that it hit the wall and landed on the floor with a thud. She didn't even turn around to adjust it. "But I'm so glad you're home, Mike. You've been so wonderful the last few days." She said it cheerfully, easily, as if there was nothing between us except everyday life, as if everything I had imagined in my head was just my fears. She stepped toward me, quickly, like a cat, and hugged me around the neck. She smelled of fresh shampoo, sweat, and mint gum. The smell was familiar, and at the same time, it now seemed alien. I smiled. I raised my arms and hugged her back, tightly, almost mechanically. "I'm glad, too," I said evenly, and every word I said cut me from the inside. It was like a knife was going deeper, pushing apart the crack between what I was showing her and what was whispering inside me, something dark and cold. I leaned down and kissed her. Her lips were warm, soft, yielding. She pressed herself against me a little tighter, wrapping her arms around my neck. The kiss could have been a comfort, it had been, once, but now it felt like slow poison, because all I could think about, as long as I felt her breath on my lips, was the camera. The camera, quietly hidden behind the books on the bedroom shelf. The camera watching our bed. The camera, silently recording every sound, every rustle, every false breath. She didn't know, or pretended not to know, and I played the role of the perfect husband, the same Mike who brings roses, surprises, picks her up from the gym, jokes at dinner. But underneath that mask, another version of me was breathing louder and louder, cold, calculating, the one who counted the days and minutes. the one who had stopped being afraid of what truth she would find. Her fingers touched my neck, lightly, tenderly. She whispered something in my ear, but I barely heard it. Inside me, there was only one question, quiet as the pounding of blood in my temples. Where have you been, Sarah? And who are you now, when you look me straight in the eyes and smile as if you are incapable of lying? I hugged her tighter, and she didn't feel how my arms squeezed a little tighter than necessary. Let's go have dinner, she said, gently pulling away and kissing me again, this time on the corner of my lips. Yes, I said, let's go. And inside myself I repeated, just a little bit more, one more evening, one more entry, and then I will assemble this puzzle to the end, no matter how terrible the picture turns out to be. The darkness of the bedroom felt alive, whispering as if the walls knew what I was about to do and were waiting, holding their breath. I stood by the shelf, clutching a tiny camera disguised as an ordinary electrical outlet, a plastic case, matte, with two thin holes that concealed the lens. It was the perfect cover, discreet, mundane, something Sarah would never suspect. I chose a spot on the wall opposite the bed, where the cord from her phone charger always dangled, giving the illusion that the outlet was in use. My fingers shook as I mounted the device, aligning it so that the lens captured the entire room, the bed, the door, the corner where her gym bag sat. I connected the camera to an app on my phone, checking the image. A bed hastily made, pillows in disarray, a window with the curtains slightly open. Everything seemed ordinary, but now this room was under my observation, like a stage on which the truth would soon unfold. I stepped back, wiped the sweat from my palms on my jeans, and took a deep breath. My heart was pounding, but not with fear, with some strange, sick excitement, like I was a hunter setting a trap. Only I didn't know if I wanted to catch my prey or prayed it would never get caught. Sarah was downstairs, humming as she made herself a smoothie before her next workout. Her voice, light and carefree, cut me like a knife because I could no longer trust it to be sincere. But I kept playing the part, the perfect husband who smiled and kissed her goodbye and told her he loved her. I had to keep up the facade until I saw for myself. I have a client meeting today, I said as I walked down to the kitchen. My voice was calm, even though I was seething inside. Sarah stood by the blender, her hair pulled back into a high ponytail, the sweatshirt clinging to her figure, reminding me of how much I had once admired her energy, her strength. Now the sweatshirt seemed like a part of her other life, one in which I was an outsider. Work again, she smiled, but there was something in her eyes I couldn't decipher. Relief, maybe. Do you ever get a break, Mike? You know how it is, I shrugged, forcing a smile. But I'm all yours tonight. Maybe we could order something. Go to a movie? Her face softened, and she came over to me, wrapping her arms around me. Her arms were warm and familiar as they wrapped around my neck, and I felt her breath on my skin. You're the best, she whispered, and her voice was so soft that for a second I almost believed her. Almost. I kissed her forehead, trying not to think about how the gesture was a lie, how I was no longer the Mike who loved her without looking back. See you later, I said, grabbing my keys and briefcase. I walked out of the house, feeling the cold Chicago air bite into my skin. But I didn't go to the meeting. Instead, I parked 2 blocks away, on a quiet side street where the shadows of old oak trees hid me from prying eyes. I pulled my laptop out of my bag, connected to the camera's Wi-Fi, and opened the app. The screen came to life, showing our bedroom, empty but full of anticipation, like a stage before a play. I sat there, staring at the screen, waiting. Waiting, even though every minute felt like an eternity, and every sound, the rustling of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, made my heart beat faster. Half an hour later, I saw her. Sarah walked into the bedroom, still wearing the same sweatshirt, her movements easy, almost casual. She sat on the bed, crossed her legs, and began scrolling on her phone, her face calm, but with a slight smile, like she was waiting for something, or someone. I clenched my teeth, my fingers digging into the edges of the laptop. I wanted to be wrong. I wanted her to just go to sleep, or stretch, or anything that would prove I was paranoid, that this was all just a figment of my tiredness and imagination. But then I heard a sound, the doorbell. Sarah jumped up, her smile widening, almost mischievous. She fixed her hair, threw the phone on the bed, and walked out of the room. I switched to the second camera, which I had set up in the hallway, disguised as a smoke detector. The door opened, and he appeared in the frame. Rob. I recognized him immediately, although I had only seen him a couple of times in photos from her gym. Young, about 28, with short dark hair and a tattoo peeking out from under the collar of his black t-shirt. He was tall, rangy, with that cocky confidence that always irritated me in guys his age. He stepped inside, and Sarah threw herself at him, her arms around his neck, his around her waist. They kissed right there in the hallway, hungrily, without looking back, as if the whole world belonged to them alone. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. My stomach clenched, and I felt a hot wave of anger rise in my throat. They were laughing, their voices coming through the camera's microphone, muffled but clear enough for me to make out. "You're late," Sarah said, her voice low, playful. "You know how I hate waiting." "But I'm here," Rob replied, his hands sliding down her back, lower than I could bear. "And we have the whole evening." I slammed my fist against the steering wheel, the pain in my knuckles sharp, but not enough to stop the pain that was tearing me apart. They walked back into the bedroom, and the camera cut to them again, this time on our bed. Sarah sat on the edge, tugging at his hand, and they began kissing again, their laughter interspersed with whispers, words I didn't want to hear but couldn't turn off. "You're so hot in that top," he murmured, and she laughed, throwing her head back. It was her laugh, the one I loved, but it wasn't for me now. I closed my laptop, unable to watch anymore. My chest was heaving, my breathing heavy, like I'd run a marathon. I sat in the car, in the dark, trying to figure out what I was feeling. Anger. Yes, it was there, hot, ready to burn away everything around me. Pain. It was deeper, like a knife stabbed into my heart and twisted over and over again. But most of all, I felt betrayal, not just hers, but my own. How could I have missed it? How could I have been so blind? Night settled on the alley where I parked like ink spilled on a canvas. The streetlights cast dim pools of light on the wet pavement, and every sound, the distant honk of a car horn, the rustle of leaves caught in the wind, felt like a signal that the world was going on while my own was crumbling. I sat in the car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, and the images from my laptop kept flashing before my eyes. Sarah, her smile, her arms around Rob, their laughter, their kisses. The images were seared into my mind like shards of glass, each one cutting deeper than the last. I could feel the anger and pain merging into a caustic mixture, bubbling somewhere in my chest, ready to burst out. I looked at our house, barely visible in the darkness, silhouetted against the night sky. The light in the bedroom was off, but I knew they were there. I knew because I could see them through the camera. I knew because their laughter still echoed in my ears. My hand reached for the doorknob, and for a moment I imagined rushing into the house, throwing open the bedroom door, catching them together. I saw myself screaming, my voice breaking, demanding answers I probably didn't want to hear. I saw everything Sarah and I had spent 10 years building crumble in an instant, like a house of cards in a gust of wind. My fingers closed around the handle, and I almost opened the door, but I stopped. Something inside me, maybe fear, maybe some lingering hope, held me back. If I went in now, it would be over. There would be no turning back. No chance to understand how far it had gone. No chance to pick myself up before I faced her. I let go of the handle, leaned back in the seat, and closed my eyes, trying to breathe evenly. My chest was heaving, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure I could hear it outside. I couldn't go in there. Not now. I needed more than anger. I needed facts, hard facts, facts that couldn't be denied. I had to know everything. I started the car and drove away without looking back. The drive home to the hotel where I decided to spend the night to hide my identity was a blur, as if I were looking at the world through fogged-up glass. I'd checked into a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, where no one asked questions and the smell of damp and old carpet permeated everything. Lying on the hard bed, I stared at the ceiling, stained by leaks, and tried to figure out who I'd become. A husband spying on his wife, a detective gathering evidence against the woman he loved, or just a fool who'd been blind to the truth for too long. Morning came with gray light filtering through the thin curtains of the motel. I got home around 7, knowing Sarah would already be up, making her morning smoothie or getting ready for her workout. I walked in quietly, setting my briefcase by the door, and heard her footsteps in the kitchen. The smell of freshly brewed coffee and toast filled the air, and for a second I felt like I was back in time to those mornings when we'd wake up together, laugh at her attempts to make anything more complicated than toast, plan the weekend. But now the smell was foreign, like a set in a theater where I knew nothing was real. Sarah was standing at the stove, wearing her favorite gray t-shirt, which was a little big for her and fell off one shoulder. She was frying an omelet, humming under her breath, her movements light, almost dancing. When she noticed me, her face lit up with a smile, the same one that used to make my heart skip a beat, but now only caused pain. "Good morning, sleepyhead," she said, flipping the omelet with a deftness I had always secretly admired. "I thought I'd treat you. An omelet with cheese, just the way you like it." I forced myself to smile, even though it was like putting a plaster mask on my face, too heavy, too alien. "You look like a chef," I said, sitting down at the table. My voice was even almost too even, as if I was reading someone else's line from a prompter. But inside, everything was screaming, trying to get out, squeezing like an icy hand somewhere under my ribs. I looked at her, at Sarah, standing at the stove, wearing an old cotton t-shirt and a pair of pajama bottoms with a small pattern. Her hair was pulled back into a messy bun, a few strands escaping and touching her neck. She held the spatula lightly, habitually flipping an omelet, as if everything were the same as always. But I saw a different Sarah, the one sitting on our bed, the same bed where she had whispered love to me a month ago. Sitting there, legs tucked under her, phone in hand, with that same look in her eyes that used to belong only to me. Laughing at Rob, that friend she had once mentioned in passing. Kissing him, hungrily, completely, with some kind of youthful, alien thirst that I hadn't seen in her for a long time. She placed a plate in front of me, steaming, smelling of greens and cheese. It smelled good, right, like before. Like home. She sat down opposite me, resting her chin on her hand, and stared at me with her dark eyes. "You came home late yesterday," she said with feigned ease, but I caught a barely noticeable tremor in her voice, a tiny chip behind the usual softness. "Is everything okay at work?" "Yeah, it's just. The meeting was dragging on," I said, and cut off a piece of omelet. I tried not to look her in the eyes. I was afraid, because if I met her gaze, I might not be able to hold back. And now I wasn't ready. Not yet. Clients, you know, always want more than they are willing to pay. She laughed. Easy, homely. The laughter rang through the kitchen as warmly as ever, and for a second the sound pierced my armor. I almost believed it almost. If you closed your eyes, you could imagine it was us again. "You work too much, Mike," she said, reaching across the table. Her fingers touched my arm. Warm, gentle, familiar. Those hands had so often comforted me, touched my face, stroked my neck in the mornings before it was dark. For a moment, I felt something inside me shake, like thin ice beneath my feet. Maybe, maybe this was all a mistake. Maybe I had misunderstood something. But memory pierced that shaky, maybe like a splinter. I remembered the recording. Her laugh, a different laugh, not for me. Her lips kissing someone else's. Her voice whispered a name that wasn't mine. My hand involuntarily tensed under her palm. I felt her squeeze my fingers slightly, as if trying to stop this cold, this rift. But it was too late. "Maybe so," I managed to say, and looked away. I ate the omelet mechanically, without taste, as if I was filling the emptiness in my stomach simply out of instinct. Sarah was saying something about plans for the evening, about how she needed to go to the gym early tomorrow. A client asked to reschedule. She spoke in a normal voice, but every word sounded like background noise to me. Dead, unnecessary noise. Now I know. I saw it with my own eyes and heard it with my own ears. The truth was worse than my worst guesses. She was there, sitting across from me, her chin in her hand, her eyes warm, her smile soft, and yet she was not there. Between us now lay this recording, this cold file that I played over and over in my head. The question was not what happened. The question was what I was going to do with this truth, and what will be left of the two of us when I finally ask her my first real question. I decided to act. Not impulsively, not in the heat of the moment, like I'd wanted to do that night when I'd almost broken into her house. I needed more evidence, more proof, so that when the time came, I could look her in the eye and leave her with no way out. I didn't know what I wanted in the end: to expose her, to leave, to try to save our marriage, but I knew I couldn't stop. Not when I'd seen her betray me in our own home. After breakfast, I said I needed to go to the office and left, even though there was no meeting. I walked back to the same alley where I'd been standing the night before and opened my laptop. The camera was still rolling, recording every moment, every movement in our bedroom. I reviewed the footage from the morning, nothing but Sarah getting ready for her workout, her usual movements, her smile in the mirror as she fixed her hair. But I knew it was only a matter of time. Rob would come back, or someone else, and I would be ready. I started planning. I checked the camera app, made sure the cloud storage was working, and set up notifications in case there was movement in the bedroom when I wasn't home. I thought about installing another camera, maybe in the living room or kitchen, where they could also meet. I even went to the website where I'd ordered the first camera and added another one to my cart, disguised as a USB charger. It was crazy, I knew, but I couldn't stop. Every step, every click on the screen was another nail in the coffin of our marriage. That night, when Sarah came home, I put the mask back on. I made dinner shrimp pasta, her favorite, and opened a bottle of wine. We sat at the table, laughing, talking about nothing, and I looked at her, trying to find a hint of guilt in her face. But she was perfect, her smile like sunlight, her voice like the music I once loved. "You're so attentive today," she said, leaning across the table to kiss me. I kissed her back, but my mind was elsewhere in the bedroom, where the camera was hidden, in the footage I would yet see, in the truth that awaited me. I knew the boiling point was near. It was just a question of how long I could hold it together before it all exploded. The morning was gray, with low clouds that seemed to weigh the city down. I sat in the living room, clutching a mug of cold coffee, while Sarah bustled around the kitchen, making her morning smoothie. Her movements were as easy as ever, her voice as warm as she called out to me, "Mike, do you want me to add some berries?" But every gesture, every sound, now felt like part of a performance I could no longer bear. I knew the truth, I'd seen it on tape, felt it like a knife in my chest. The question wasn't what I knew anymore, but how I was going to deal with it. It was time to stop being a victim. It was time to take control. I'd been plotting this for days. The anger that had boiled inside me that night in the car had given way to a cold, almost surgical determination. I didn't want to just scream or storm out. I wanted both of them, Sarah and Rob, to know that their secret was out. I wanted to see their faces when they realized that I knew everything. But to do that, I needed more than security footage. I needed to catch them red-handed, to create a moment when neither of them could lie or wriggle out of it, and I knew how to do it. The first step was to lure Rob out. I waited for the right moment, and it arrived when Sarah went to take a shower. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, the screen flashing with a notification. I knew her password; she'd never changed it since we started dating. My heart was racing as I picked up the phone, unlocked it, and opened the text messages with Rob. Their messages were short, but each word cut me like a blade. "Miss you," she wrote. "Tonight," he responded. I gritted my teeth, resisting the urge to throw the phone against the wall. Instead, I typed a new message from her. "Mike's leaving again. Come by at 7. Door will be open." I hit send, adrenaline coursing through my veins. Almost immediately, she responded, "I will. Can't wait." I deleted the messages from her phone so she wouldn't suspect anything and put it back. The next step was harder, convincing Sarah that I was leaving. I knew that the slightest falsehood, one wrong look, would cause everything to collapse like a house of cards. She knew me too well, or thought she did. At breakfast, I casually mentioned an urgent meeting downtown. I deliberately spoke with a lazy tiredness in my voice, rolled my eyes, wiggled my eyebrows, all to make it sound like a routine and not like a prepared retort. "These clients from New York again," I said, reaching for the mug. I pretended to wince, as if just thinking about it was already tiring me out. "Looks like I'll be staying late. I might even stay in the office until morning, otherwise we'll never get this report in." I felt her eyes on me before I finished my sentence. I looked up, and for a moment our gazes met. Her smile was soft, familiar, but there was something in her eyes, a tiny trace of doubt. I saw her grip tighten on the handle of her mug before she set it down on the table. "You work too much," Sarah said, leaning forward to place her hand on mine. Her fingers were warm and soft, her skin thin. It was so strange to feel that touch, and to know that there was nothing behind it but a well-acted scene. "I'll miss you." She said it quietly, smiling slightly. I saw a shadow in that smile, a tiny curve at the corners of her mouth that I had once taken for tenderness. Now I wasn't sure it meant anything at all. "Me too," I said, and forced myself to smile back. I pulled it over my face like a tightly fitted mask, hoping she wouldn't see that underneath was emptiness and cold. I leaned toward her, kissed her cheek. Her skin smells sweet, like the vanilla lotion I'd given her for our anniversary 3 years ago. I inhaled it, and my heart clenched with a strange mixture of love, rage, and something like betrayal, not hers, but my own. She hugged me around the neck, so easily, so habitually. "Be careful on the road," she whispered in my ear. I nodded, hiding my face in her shoulder so she couldn't see my eyes. She didn't know that I'd seen it all, that I knew every detail, from the way she looked at Rob to the way she laughed at his jokes in our bed. She didn't know that I already had the truth in my pocket, a heavy black flash drive with the recording in it tucked into my jacket. And she didn't know that I was preparing for the moment when this game would end, when everything we called us would shatter into pieces, and everything I had done now, this casual excuse, the forced smile, the kiss goodbye, it had all been a disguise, the last touch before the storm. I let go of her and walked towards the door, feeling her fingers hold onto my sleeve for a second before letting go. "Don't wait for me," I said, trying to sound tired and distracted. "Really, take a rest." "Okay," Sarah said quietly, and I saw her eyes follow me, searching again for something, a hint, a slight crack. But her face was as even as ever. I closed the door behind me and heard the lock click. Outside, I exhaled, the first real breath I had taken all morning. The gray Chicago morning air burned my throat. Everything was going according to plan, and now there was only one thing left to do: see this show through to the end. After breakfast, I left the house, but not the office. I went back to the same electronics store where I ordered the first camera and bought two more, one disguised as a USB charger for the living room and one disguised as a motion sensor for the hallway. Back home, while Sarah was at practice, I installed them with the same care I had taken with the first one. The living room camera was hidden among the wires near the TV and in the hallway on the ceiling where no one would notice another sensor. I checked them on the app. The image was sharp, the sound was clear. Now the entire house was under my control, and I felt simultaneously omnipotent and insignificant. The key was to leave the front door open. Not quite wide open, of course. I turned the lock so it wouldn't click, giving the illusion that someone had simply forgotten to lock it. It was a risk, but I knew Rob, his cockiness, his confidence. He wouldn't ring the doorbell if Sarah had texted that it was open. He'd just walk in like he had a right to. By 6 o'clock, I was ready. I told Sarah I was leaving and walked away with my briefcase, as if I were heading to the office. Instead, I parked the car down the block, in the shade of an old maple tree where no one would notice. In the trunk was a hunting rifle, an old one that had belonged to my dad and that I kept in the garage for the occasional hunting trip. I had no intention of using it, not really, but I wanted Rob to see it, to feel his world shrink in fear the way mine did in pain. I picked up the gun, checked that it was unloaded, and laid it on the passenger seat, covering it with my jacket. My laptop was open, the camera app showing an empty living room, an empty hallway, an empty bedroom. I waited. At 6:55, I saw movement. The hallway camera flickered to life, and Rob walked into the frame. He walked in like he'd been here 100 times before, confident, with a slight smirk on his face, kicking off his sneakers at the door. The tattoo on his collarbone flashed as he took off his jacket, and I felt the anger rise up inside me again, hot and uncontrollable. He headed into the living room, and I switched to the other camera. He sat down on the couch, pulling out his phone, his fingers flicking across the screen. I knew he was texting Sarah, and my heart sank at the thought that she'd be here soon. I stepped out of the car, clutching the gun in my hands. My steps were heavy, but I moved quietly, like a predator who doesn't want to spook his prey. The door to the house was ajar, just as I'd left it. I walked in, adrenaline pumping through my veins, and headed into the living room. Rob looked up when he heard my footsteps, and his face went pale, as if the blood had instantly drained from him. He jumped up, his eyes widening when he saw the gun in my hands. "Mike," his voice was shaky, lacking the brashness I'd heard on the tapes. What are you doing here?" I didn't answer, just looked at him, letting the silence and the weight of the gun do the talking. My gaze was cold, but inside I was seething. I wanted him to feel it, the fear, the helplessness, the knowledge that he'd gone too far. His hands went up as if he were trying to protect himself, but he didn't move, frozen by my gaze and the dark barrel of the gun pointed in his direction. "You thought I wouldn't recognize you?" My voice was low, almost growling. I took a step forward, and he took a step back, tripping over the couch. "You thought you could just walk into my house, into my wife's, and I wouldn't notice?" "Mike, listen, it's not what you think," he began, but his words sounded weak, like he didn't believe them. I cut him off, raising the gun a little higher to shut him up. It was theatrical, I knew, but I needed him to feel as vulnerable as I felt looking at those tapes. At that moment, I heard the sound of a car pulling up. Headlights flashed past the window, and I knew Sarah was back. My plan had worked too well, and now everything was about to be decided. The door opened, and her voice, surprised, almost frightened, pierced the silence. "Mike? Rob? What's going on here?" She stood in the doorway, her duffel bag slung over her shoulder, her eyes darting between me and Rob, between the gun and his pale face. I turned to her, still clutching the gun, and for the first time looked her straight in the eye. There was everything in her eyes: shock, fear, guilt, and I knew the game was on for real. The silence in the living room was so thick it was almost tangible, like a heavy cloth hanging over us. The light from the lamp over the table cast long shadows that made Sarah and Rob's faces seem almost unreal, like masks about to crack. I stood in the doorway, still clutching the gun, though its barrel was now lowered toward the floor. My fingers were shaking, not from fear, but from suppressed rage, from the pain that pulsed through my chest like an open wound. Sarah froze in the doorway, her duffel bag slipping from her shoulder and falling to the floor with a thud. Her eyes, wide, darted between me and Rob, who was standing by the couch, pale as a sheet, his hands raised in some pathetic gesture of surrender. "Mike," her voice was hoarse, almost pleading. "Please take it away. What are you doing?" I looked at her, the woman I'd loved for over a decade, her dark hair still damp from her shower, her face a face I knew better than my own. But now it felt foreign, as if someone had replaced her, leaving only a shell. I didn't answer right away, letting the silence weigh on her, on him, on all of us. Then, slowly, as if every movement were part of a ritual, I laid the gun on the coffee table, far enough away that it didn't seem threatening, but close enough that its presence was felt. I didn't want to scare them, not like that. I wanted answers. "Sit down," I said, my voice quiet but as hard as steel. I nodded toward the dining room table in the corner of the living room, where Sarah and I had eaten so many dinners, laughed, and made plans. Now it would be the setting for a different kind of conversation. Both. Rob looked at Sarah as if searching for clues, but she didn't move, her gaze fixed on me. "Mike, let's talk, just you and me," she began, her voice shaking but trying to maintain control. "It's not what you think." I said sit down, I repeated, not raising my voice, but putting all the weight that had built up in me over the past few days into the words. She flinched, as if my tone had struck her, and walked slowly toward the table. Rob followed, his movements awkward, like a man who knows he's trapped. They sat down across from each other, and I took my place at the head of the table, like a judge about to pass a sentence. I took my phone out of my pocket, turned on the voice recorder app, and placed it on the table, pressing record. The red dot blinked, and I saw Sarah's eyes widen. "Mike, what are you doing?" Her voice was almost a whisper, but there was already a sense of panic in it. "I'm writing it down," I answered calmly, looking her straight in the eye, "so that later there won't be any you got it wrong. I want to know the truth, the whole truth, and we'll start with a simple question, why?" Sarah swallowed, her fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of her sweatshirt. Rob sat silently, his gaze glued to the table as if he hoped the floor would swallow him. The silence stretched on, and I could feel it weighing on them, forcing them to talk. I wasn't going to yell, wasn't going to make a scene. Yelling wouldn't solve anything. I wanted them to say it, to let their words be the nails in the coffin of what I once thought was my life. "Mike, it's not. Nothing serious," Sarah began, her voice weak, as if she didn't believe what she was saying. "Rob, he's just a client. We were just chatting, joking. You know how it is at the gym." I looked at her, and every word she said hit me like a blow. She was lying, right to my face. I could see them on the tapes, their laughter, their kisses, their whispers full of intimate promises. But I didn't interrupt, didn't raise my voice. I just nodded, as if her words made sense, and asked, "Talking. Is that why he's here in our house? Is that why I found his sock under our bed? Is that why there was a condom wrapper in the trash, even though we hadn't used one in 2 years?" Her face went pale, her lips trembled, but she still tried to hold on. "The sock, Mike, it's probably yours. Or, I don't know, maybe one of your friends left it. And the packaging, I don't even know what you're talking about. It might be old, you know how trash piles up." I almost admired her audacity. She sat there, looking me in the eye, lying so naturally, as if it were second nature. But I could see her hands shaking, her eyes darting, and I knew she couldn't stand it for long. I turned to Rob, who was still silent, his shoulders tense, as if he were expecting a blow. "What do you say?" I asked, my voice level, but with a threat in it, not the physical kind, but the kind that makes people feel naked under a gaze. "Were you just chatting too, or do you have something to add?" Rob opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His eyes darted to Sarah, and I saw fear in them, not of me, but of what he might say. He'd been young, brash, on the tapes, but now he looked like a kid caught stealing candy. I didn't mean anything bad," he finally managed, his voice hoarse. It happened. "It just happened," I repeated, letting the words hang in the air. "Okay, let's try again. When did this start? How long have you been seeing each other behind my back? A month? 2? A year?" Sarah shook her head, her eyes filling with tears, but I wasn't sure if they were real or not. "Mike, please, it's not like that. It was a mistake. One time. I was lonely. You were traveling all the time. Once," I leaned forward, my voice quiet, but each word like a hammer blow. "You were sitting on our bed, Sarah. You were laughing with him, kissing him, whispering to him the things you were supposed to be telling me. I saw it. I have records. So don't lie to me. Not now." Her face twisted, tears streaming down her cheeks, but there was something else in them, now not just fear, but recognition. She knew what I'd seen, knew her lies were crumbling like a house of cards. "Mike, I didn't mean for this to happen," her voice broke, and she covered her face with her hands. "It started a couple months ago. I don't know how it happened. He was there when you weren't. I just wanted to feel alive." Alive. That word hit me harder than anything else. I looked at her, the woman I loved, the woman I'd planned children with, the woman I'd built this house with, and tried to figure out how I'd failed to notice that she felt dead next to me. My hands clenched into fists under the table, but I didn't let the anger spill out. Instead, I asked, why? Why did you do that, Sarah? If you were sick, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you leave if I was that bad? She looked up, her eyes red from crying, but there was something hard, almost angry, in them. Because you were never here, Mike. Always on your trips, on your reports, in your office. I tried to talk, but you wouldn't listen. You'd come home, kiss me, and fall asleep like I was just part of the furniture. Rob, he saw me. He listened. I felt her words dig into me like needles. They were true or part of the truth, and that made them hurt even more. I knew I was busy, knew my work was consuming me, but I always thought I was doing this for us, for our future. I wanted to argue, to say that she could fight for us, could scream until I heard. But instead, I just nodded, letting her speak. Rob was silent, his gaze fixed on the table, as if he were hoping to become invisible. I turned to him. And you? What do you say? You knew she was married. Knew this was my house, my wife. Why did you do it? He swallowed, his throat moving, but he didn't look at me. I didn't think it was that serious, he mumbled. She said that you had problems. I liked her. I didn't want to hurt anyone. I laughed, briefly and bitterly, and the sound surprised even me. Didn't mean any harm. You came to my house, slept with my wife, and now you're saying you didn't mean any harm. He flinched, but said nothing. Sarah sobbed, her hands still covering her face, but I could see her shoulders shaking. I turned off the recorder, even though I knew the recording had done its job. I wasn't sure why I'd turned it on, maybe to have proof, maybe to listen back later and make sure it wasn't a dream. But now that I'd heard their words, I knew I didn't need proof anymore. The truth was there, naked and ugly, and I didn't know what to do with it. I stood up, my movement slow, as if I was afraid any sudden action would tear me apart. I don't know what's going to happen next, I said, looking at Sarah, but I know I can't pretend it didn't happen anymore. She looked up, her eyes full of tears, but pleading. Mike, please, we can fix this. I'll do whatever you want. Just give me a chance. I looked at her, at Rob, at our house, which now seemed alien to me, and shook my head. I don't know, Sarah. I really don't know. The living room, once the heart of our home, now felt like a stage in someone else's play, where I was not an actor, but a spectator, forced to watch my own life being destroyed. The light from the lamp over the dining table was harsh, casting harsh shadows on the faces of Sarah and Rob as they sat across from each other. Sarah was still sobbing, her hands shaking as she clutched the hem of her sweatshirt, tears leaving wet tracks down her cheeks. Rob looked like a cornered animal, his eyes darting between the table and me, as if he were searching for a way out but knew there was none. The tape recorder lay between us, its red dot long gone, but the recording it held was a bomb, ready to detonate everything that was left of Sarah's and my lives. The shotgun on the coffee table was silent, but its presence still weighed on the air, a reminder of how close I had come to losing control. I stood at the head of the table, my hands on the back of the chair, and I looked at them, at the woman I'd loved for over a decade, and at the boy who'd walked into my house like he had a right to do so. My anger, the one that had been bubbling inside me since the night I'd seen them on tape, had cooled into something more dangerous now, a cold, calculating determination. I could have screamed, I could have thrown something at the wall, I could have lashed out at Rob or told Sarah to get out of my house. But that would have been too easy, too impulsive. I wanted them to feel what I felt, not just pain, but the weight of truth that made it hard to breathe. I wanted them to live with it, as I now had to. Thank you for telling the truth, I said, my voice quiet, almost soft, but there was a steel in it that made Sarah look up and Rob flinch. I looked at her, right into her tear-stained eyes, and continued, now I know who I'm living with. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Sarah opened her mouth to say something, but I raised my hand, stopping her. I didn't want to hear any more of her excuses, her tears, her attempts to explain away something that couldn't be fixed. I turned to Rob, who still avoided my gaze, and added, and who I share my home with. I leaned over the table, picked up the recorder, and put it in my pocket. Then I took a flash drive from my other pocket, a small, black, metal-rimmed one onto which I had previously copied all the footage from the cameras. Their laughter, their kisses, their whispers in our bedroom. I placed the flash drive on the table, carefully, almost ceremonially, right between them. "This is for you," I said, my voice flat, without a trace of emotion. "Watch it as much as you want. Rewatch it. Remind yourself of what you did." Sarah stared at the flash drive, her eyes widening, and I saw the horror flash through them. She knew what was in there, knew I'd seen it all. "Mike, please," her voice broke, and she reached for me, but I stepped back, not letting her touch me. "We can fix this. I'll do whatever you want. Just don't do it." "Do what?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. My tone was almost curious, but inside I could feel the coldness coursing through my veins, pushing out the last vestiges of warmth I'd once felt for her. "I'm not doing anything, Sarah. I'm just leaving. You can handle it." Rob finally looked up, his face pale, his lips trembling. "Mike, look, I didn't mean to," he began, but I cut him off without even raising my voice. "You've said enough." I looked at him, and there was no anger in my eyes, only weariness. "You thought you could come here, take what wasn't yours, and walk away without consequences. But now you're going to live with it. Both of you." I turned and walked toward the door, my steps slow but sure. I could feel their eyes on my back, heard Sarah sob again, but I didn't turn around. I didn't want to see her tears. I didn't want to see his fear. I wanted them to stay with this moment, with this flash drive, with this truth that would haunt them now the way it haunted me. I paused at the threshold, my hand on the doorknob. The air in the house was heavy, thick with the scent of her perfume, the coffee she'd brewed that morning, and something else, a betrayal that seemed to have ingrained itself in the walls. I turned halfway, looking over my shoulder at them. "Don't look for me," I said, my voice calm but final, like the sound of a lock closing. "I'll decide what happens next." I walked out without closing the door behind me. The cold Chicago wind hit my face, but it felt almost good, cleansing, like it was washing away everything I'd left inside. My car was parked in the alley where I'd hidden the night I watched the tapes. I got behind the wheel, tossed the recorder into the passenger's seat, and started the engine. The flash drive I'd left them wasn't the only copy. I had another one, just in case, in my jacket pocket. But I wasn't going to use it. Not now. This wasn't revenge in the traditional sense, not yelling, not fighting, not suing. This was cold revenge, the kind that leaves them alone with their own actions, their guilt, their fear of what I might do with the tapes. I drove through the empty streets, not knowing where I was going. Maybe to the motel where I'd stayed a few nights ago. Maybe to a bar where I could drown my thoughts in whiskey. Maybe just away from this city that now felt foreign to me. My mind was empty, as if all the energy, all the anger, all the pain had burned away, leaving only clarity. I knew I wouldn't be coming home today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe never. Sarah and Rob got what they deserved, not a punch, not a scream, but a mirror in which they would see themselves as they really were. I stopped at a traffic light, staring at a red light that seemed to have been on for far too long. My phone vibrated a text from Sarah. "Mike, please come back. We can talk." I looked at the screen but didn't answer. Instead, I turned off the phone and tossed it on the seat next to the recorder. Let them think I'd disappeared. Let them wonder what I'd do with the recordings. Let them live with it, as I now lived with their betrayal. The road ahead was dark, but I knew I would find my way. Not today, not tomorrow, but I would. And as I drove, I felt the cold in my chest turn into a strange, almost liberating calm. I was free not from pain, but from illusion. And this was the beginning of something new, even if I didn't yet know what it was. 2 weeks later, Chicago was still mired in the gray haze of autumn, but the city felt different to me, not familiar, not close, but distant, like the set of a movie I no longer wanted to star in. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood where no one knew my name, where the streets were quieter and people didn't ask questions. The apartment was cramped, with faded wallpaper and creaky hardwood floors, but it was mine a sanctuary where I could breathe without the scent of betrayal that seemed to permeate my home with Sarah. I hadn't been back there since the night I left them with the recorder and the flash drive, but my thoughts still swirled around them. Sarah, Rob, their lies, their laughter, their hands intertwined on our bed. I wasn't a man given to revenge. At least, that's what I thought of myself before. My life has always been orderly. Work, home, Sarah, plans for the future. But now that that order had been shattered, I discovered something new in myself, a cold, methodical determination that frightened me. I didn't want to scream or fight. I wanted them to feel what it was like to live with the consequences of their actions, just as I now lived with their betrayal. And I knew how to do it. The first step was to file for divorce. I found a lawyer, an older man named Howard, with tired eyes and a voice that sounded like he'd seen too many broken homes. He didn't ask too many questions when I handed him the flash drive with the recordings and the tape recorder with their confessions. "This will speed things up," he said, adjusting his glasses, and I nodded without going into details. I didn't want Sarah to get half of everything we'd built, but I also didn't want to drag this out. I wanted her to know that I wasn't leaving because I was weak, but because I had nothing left to give her. The divorce papers arrived 2 weeks after that night. I imagined Sarah opening the envelope, her fingers shaking as she read the dry legalese that reduced our marriage to a series of clauses and signatures. But the papers were just the beginning. I wanted the truth to spill out, to stop being our dirty little secret. I made copies of the recordings, not all of them, just the key moments. Their kisses in the bedroom, their laughter, their whispers, her confession at the dinner table. I edited the videos, trimming the most intimate details, but leaving enough that there was no doubt what had happened. Then I emailed the files from an anonymous email address I'd created through a VPN so no one could track me down. The recipients were Sarah's mother, her best friend Lisa, and the management at the gym where she worked as a trainer. I didn't know how they would react, but I could imagine. Sarah's mother, Helen, had always been a woman of strict principles, with a stern gaze and a voice that could make anyone feel guilty. She loved me, called me the son she never had, and I knew these tapes would break her heart not just for Sarah, but because she thought we were the perfect couple. Lisa, Sarah's friend from high school, was different, blunt, outspoken, always ready to tell the truth to her face. I knew she wouldn't forgive Sarah for lying, for keeping this from even her. And the gym, it was her world, her pride, the place where she felt strong, confident. The tapes would jeopardize her reputation, her clients, her place in this community. But that wasn't the only part of my plan. Rob couldn't get away with it either. I created a fake social media account, nothing fancy, just a faceless profile with a fake name and a blurry photo of a sunset as an avatar. I uploaded a few screenshots from posts that showed Rob's face, his collarbone tattoo, the smirk he gave us as he walked into our house. I added captions short but venomous. "Meet Rob Carter, the guy who loves to destroy families, professional trainer, or pro strings. Professional homewrecker." I didn't post the entire video, that would have been too much, even for me, but the photos and captions were telling enough. I posted them to local fitness groups, to chat rooms where Rob's clients hung out, and to a couple of popular Chicago public pages. I knew how fast word spread in those circles. I knew his reputation, his bread and butter, his life would be ruined once people started forwarding the posts. A few days later, I started getting texts. Not from Sarah or Rob, of course I'd blocked their numbers, but from mutual friends who knew nothing of my plan but had heard the gossip. "Have you heard what's going on with Rob Carter?" one of my coworkers, whom I sometimes ran into at the bar, wrote. "Some anonymous person posted pictures of him with someone's wife. Total trash." I didn't respond, but I felt a cold sense of satisfaction. My revenge was working. Sarah called me the next day, but I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail, her voice broken, full of tears. "Mike, how could you? My mom, Lisa, the gym, they all know. You ruined my life." I didn't call back. I didn't want her words, her excuses. I wanted her to live with the consequences, just like I lived with her betrayal. A week later, I received a letter from Lisa. It was brief, but her words were like a punch to the gut. Sarah is in agony. She doesn't justify herself, but what you did. It was cruel. I don't know if I can forgive you. I didn't tell her either. Lisa was right, it was cruel. But I didn't feel guilty. I felt empty, like everything inside me, the love, the anger, the pain had burned away, leaving only ashes. I didn't want to destroy Sarah. I didn't want to ruin her life. I wanted her to understand that her actions had consequences, that her choices weren't just mistakes to be forgotten over coffee and apologies. I wanted her to feel the same emptiness I felt. Rob, by all accounts, had lost almost all of his clients. Chicago's fitness community was tight-knit, and news traveled fast. People didn't like trainers who slept with married women, especially if those women were co-workers. His schedule, once packed, was empty. Someone even wrote on one of his public pages, "Rob Carter is a disgrace to our gym." I read it and closed my laptop. My revenge was complete, but it brought no relief. It was as cold as a winter wind and just as unfeeling. I sat in my apartment, looking out at the city through a murky window. The divorce notice was just the beginning. The tapes, the photos, the rumors, it was my way of putting an end to it, but it wasn't the end I'd expected. I thought I'd feel stronger, freer, but instead I felt empty. I'd destroyed their lives, but my own was in ruins. I didn't know what to do next, start a new life, leave town, forget it all like a bad dream. But I knew one thing. I was no longer Mike who loved Sarah, who believed in their future. I was someone else, and I had yet to get to know him. I turned on the radio to drown out the silence. An old song played, and I closed my eyes, letting it fill the void. My revenge was cold, but it was mine. And now that it was over, I had to find a way to live with myself. Chicago was behind me, its skyscrapers and bustling streets fading into the rearview mirror like memories I wanted to erase. I was driving west to Portland, Oregon, a city I knew only from stories from coworkers and the occasional online article. Why Portland? I wasn't quite sure. Maybe it was because it was far enough away that I could start over. Maybe it was because its rainy streets and green hills felt like a place to escape the past. Or maybe it was simply because it was the first place that came to mind when I realized I couldn't stay in a city where every corner reminded me of Sarah, of our home, of her betrayal. My new apartment was small but cozy, with a view of the Willamette River and an old bridge covered in rust, as if time had decided to leave its mark on it. I moved the bare minimum, a couple suitcases of clothes, a laptop, a few books. The rest, the furniture, the photographs, the mementos of my life with Sarah, I left in Chicago, in a house that no longer felt like my own. I didn't want to drag that baggage, physical or emotional, with me. But I did keep one thing, the flash drive with the recordings. Not to rewatch them, not to torture myself. It was my insurance policy, my last resort, my way of reminding Sarah and Rob that their actions would haunt them like a shadow. Before leaving, I completed my plan, the parting gift I had conceived in those first days after their confession at the living room table. I didn't want them to forget. I didn't want them to simply move on as if nothing had happened, as if their lies and betrayals were just a small mistake that could be covered up with fresh paint and new smiles. I wanted the truth to stay with them forever, like a scar that never heals completely. I started with Sarah. The divorce was underway, and my lawyer, Howard, insisted everything was going smoothly. But the subpoena and the recordings I'd sent to Sarah's mother, her friend Lisa, the gym were only part of the plan. I decided to take one more step, to make sure Sarah would never be able to erase me from her life entirely. I created another anonymous email through a secure server and sent it to her. There were no threats, no anger, just the cold, hard truth. "You thought you could live like nothing happened," I wrote. "But the truth will always find you. I left you a reminder. Keep it. You know where." Attached was another copy of the recording, not the whole thing, just her confession at the table, her tears, her words about how alive she felt with Rob. I knew she couldn't delete it, couldn't stop listening. It was like a poison that would poison her every time she tried to forget. For Rob, I had something different in mind. His reputation in Chicago was already in tatters. The fake account's posts had taken their toll. His clients had fled, the fitness community had turned its back, and rumor had it he'd even lost his job at the gym where he'd once been a star. But I wanted him to know this wasn't the end. I sent him a package, a plain gray envelope with no return address, delivered via courier so no one could trace the sender. Inside was a USB drive identical to the one I'd left in the living room that night, and a short note typed on a plain piece of paper. You thought this was in the past. The truth always comes back. The drive contained the same footage: his smirk, his tattoo, his hands on Sarah. I didn't know if he'd look at it, but I knew he couldn't throw it away without checking what was in it. And every time he sees her, he will remember me, my home, my wife, whom he dared to touch. I didn't stop there. I made another post through the same fake account, less overt than the previous ones, but still venomous enough. A photo of Rob leaving our house with the caption, "Some lessons come too late. Be careful who you play with." I didn't include his name, but those who knew him would understand. I knew the rumors would continue to spread like ripples, and his name would be associated with this scandal for a long time. This wasn't just revenge, it was ensuring he'd never be able to fully start over without looking over his shoulder. In Portland, I started a new life, but it wasn't like the inspirational stories you see in the movies. I found a job not as prestigious as the one in Chicago, but good enough to pay the bills, as a sales manager for a small organic food company. The work was calm, routine, and exactly what I needed, something that didn't require an emotional investment from me. I took to walking along the riverfront in the evenings, listening to the river lapping against the shore, trying to find some peace in the sound. Sometimes I'd stop at a local bar, grab a beer, and watch people laugh, flirt, and live as if their world wasn't falling apart. I didn't envy them, but I felt like an outsider, as if my ability to belong was somewhere in Chicago, in the house I'd left behind. I didn't keep tabs on Sarah and Rob after I left. I didn't check their social media, call mutual friends, or search for news. But I would occasionally get messages from old friends who, without knowing it, would mention her. "Sarah quit her gym," one wrote. "Word is she moved in with her mom." Or, "I heard Rob is trying to open his own gym, but no one wants to work with him." Each message was a little nudge, a reminder that my parting gift was still working, just as I'd intended. One evening, sitting on the balcony of my apartment with a mug of tea, I pulled out that flash drive, my copy of the tapes. I hadn't looked at it since that night, but holding it in my hands was strangely comforting. It wasn't about revenge or anger. It was about control, about finally taking control of my life. I didn't know who I would become in this new city, in this new life. Maybe I would find someone who would make me feel warm again. Maybe I would end up alone, but it would be my choice, not someone's betrayal. I threw the flash drive back into the drawer and walked out onto the balcony, looking out at the lights of Portland flickering in the darkness. Sarah and Rob would remember me. They would remember who they had played with every time they saw the flash drive, heard the rumors, felt the looks. And this was my last gift to them, not anger, not screaming, but the cold, unforgiving truth that would stay with them forever. The truth can be painful, but together we make it easier. Leave your opinion below. Each word will find an address. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think, click to the next one.